The lake house had always been my safe haven. Nestled in the pines along Lake Tahoe's north shore, it was where Thomas and I spent our honeymoon, where we escaped for quiet weekends, and where he taught me to sail in the crystal-clear waters. Now, 6 months after his death, it was the only place I could still feel close to him. I'm Julia Anderson, formerly Julia Chen, and at 36 I never expected to be fighting my mother-in-law for my husband's inheritance. But Margaret Anderson had other plans for the family property, plans that didn't include her Chinese-American daughter-in-law. Thomas and I met in law school at Stanford. He came from old money. The Andersons had been California land developers for 3 generations. I was a scholarship student whose parents owned a small grocery store in San Francisco's Chinatown. On paper, we were an unlikely match. In reality, we were perfect. "You challenge me," he'd say, grinning after one of our heated debates about property law. "Everyone else just agrees with me because I'm an Anderson." His family's reaction to our relationship was mixed. His father, George, welcomed me warmly, impressed by my academic achievements and career ambitions. His younger sister, Emma, became my closest friend, often joining us for weekend trips to the lake house. But Margaret never quite got over her son choosing someone who didn't fit her society page aspirations. "At least she's a lawyer," I overheard her telling her friends at our engagement party, "even if she's not quite what we expected for Thomas." The lake house had been Thomas's sanctuary since childhood. When his grandfather left it to him in a private trust on his 21st birthday, it became our special place. We'd spent the last weekend of his life there, planning our future. "I want our kids to grow up knowing this place," he'd said, watching the sunset from our deck, learning to swim in the lake, having adventures in the woods, just like I did. 3 days later, he was gone. A pulmonary embolism, sudden, unexpected, devastating. One moment we were planning our family, the next I was planning his funeral. The first few weeks passed in a blur of grief and paperwork. Margaret took charge immediately, sweeping in with her perfect blonde hair and pearls to orchestrate everything. I was too numb to argue about the flowers, the service arrangements, the endless parade of society figures I barely knew. But then came the meeting at Thomas's estate. "It's just a formality, dear," Margaret said, her voice honey-sweet as she led me into her husband's study. "Family tradition, really. All Anderson properties are held in the main family trust. We just need you to sign these papers transferring Thomas's holdings back to the trust." I stared at the stack of documents she placed before me. "But the lake house. Thomas's grandfather left it to him directly. It's not part of the family trust." Margaret's smile tightened. "All Anderson properties belong in the trust, Julia. It's how we've preserved the family wealth for generations. Surely you understand the importance of tradition." I did understand. I understood that she was trying to take advantage of my grief, to seize control of the one piece of property that had been solely Thomas's. But I was exhausted, drowning in sorrow, and somehow I found myself nodding as she pointed to line after line requiring my signature. Looking back, I should have read those documents more carefully. I should have called my own lawyer instead of trusting the family attorney who kept assuring me it was all standard procedure. But grief does strange things to your judgment. It wasn't until 2 months later, when I tried to visit the lake house for Thomas's birthday, that I realized what I'd done. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson," the property manager said awkwardly, "but I have strict instructions from Mrs. Anderson, or the elder Mrs. Anderson, that the property is off limits. She's having it renovated for the summer season." I drove home in a daze, my mind racing. That evening, I pulled out my copies of the documents I'd signed. Reading them properly for the first time, my lawyer's training finally kicked in. Margaret hadn't just had me sign over the lake house. She'd had me relinquish all claims to Thomas's separate property, including his personal investments and the tech startup he'd been quietly building. "Oh God, what had I done?" I whispered to our empty apartment. The next day, I started digging. As a corporate lawyer myself, I knew where to look. The Anderson family trust documents, property records, Thomas's grandfather's will. I requested everything. Most importantly, I started going through Thomas's home office, looking for any records he might have kept. I found them in an encrypted folder on his laptop, hidden behind layers of security that took me days to crack. The password made me smile through tears. "Julia loves Lake Tahoe," followed by the date we first sailed together. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Thomas had been investigating the family trust for months before his death. There were discrepancies in the property holdings, suspicious transfers, and evidence that Margaret had been manipulating the trust's assets for years. But the real shock came in an email draft dated 3 days before he died. Mom, I know what you've done with the trust funds. The missing properties, the hidden accounts, the diverted rental income, all of it. I'm meeting with the trustees next week to present evidence unless you agree to step down as trustee immediately. I also know about grandfather's real will, the one you hid when he died. The lake house wasn't the only property he left outside the family trust. This ends now. Thomas. The email was never sent. Instead, my healthy, athletic husband had died suddenly of a pulmonary embolism, a condition that can be caused by certain medications. My hands shook as I opened the next file. It was a scanned copy of Thomas's grandfather's true will, drastically different from the one that had been probated. The lake house wasn't the only property he tried to protect from the family trust. There were other holdings, significant ones deliberately placed in separate trusts for his grandchildren. A note attached to the will caught my eye. It was in Thomas's grandfather's handwriting. To my grandchildren, I've watched Margaret's growing influence over the family with concern. The trust was meant to preserve our legacy, not become a tool for control. These properties are your independent inheritance, free from the trust's restrictions. Use them wisely. I sat in Thomas's office until dawn, reading through everything. The truth was clear. Margaret had been manipulating the family's assets for years, using the trust as her personal piggy bank while maintaining an iron grip on the family through financial control. And now she had tricked me into signing away not just the lake house, but all of Thomas's independent inheritance, an inheritance he had died trying to protect. My grief turned to anger, then to determination. I was a lawyer, trained to fight precisely these kinds of battles. More importantly, I was Thomas's widow, and I owed it to his memory to expose the truth. I made 3 calls that morning, one to Emma, who I knew would want to know what her mother had done, one to a forensic accountant who specialized in trust fraud, and one to George Anderson's oldest friend, a judge who had never quite trusted his daughter-in-law. Judge Williams, this is Julia Anderson. I need your help with something. How much do you know about the Anderson Family Trust? What I didn't know then was that Margaret had plans of her own for the lake house. Plans involving a surprise wedding that would shock the entire family. But she was about to learn that underestimating Thomas's widow was a serious mistake. The truth about Margaret Anderson's deception unraveled on a sunny morning in June, exactly 3 months after I discovered Thomas's hidden files. I was in my office at Chen and Partners, the law firm I'd started after leaving my corporate position, when Emma burst in, her face flushed with anger. You won't believe what Mom's planning, she said, dropping into the chair across from my desk. She's getting married. At the lake house. Next month. I set down my coffee cup carefully. Married? To whom? Robert Sterling. Emma's voice dripped with disgust. You know, Dad's old business partner. The one who mysteriously got all those lucrative development deals after Dad died. Robert Sterling. The name appeared multiple times in Thomas's investigation files. He and Margaret had been spotted together at private dinners, always careful to maintain the appearance of a business relationship. But Thomas had suspected something more sinister. She's already renovating the house. Emma continued. New furniture, new landscaping, using trust money, of course. She's telling everyone it's going to be the society event of the year. My heart raced as pieces started falling into place. Margaret's insistence on me signing over the lake house, the rushed renovations, the secret meetings with Sterling, it was all part of a larger plan. Linda Martinez, the forensic accountant I'd hired, had already uncovered a pattern of property transfers between Margaret and Sterling going back years. Properties would mysteriously move from the Anderson Trust to Sterling's development company, then be resold at massive profits, with kickbacks flowing through offshore accounts. But the lake house was different. According to Thomas's files, it sat on land that was crucial for Sterling's newest development project, a luxury resort that would require access to the lake, a project that couldn't proceed as long as the property remained under independent ownership. There's more, Emma said, lowering her voice. I overheard Mom talking to Robert about Thomas, about his death. My hands gripped the desk. What did they say? Something about how fortunate It was that Thomas never got to meet with the trustees. How everything worked out as planned. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Julia, you don't think? I think it's time we talk to the police, I said quietly. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation, from the Financial Crimes Unit took our evidence seriously, especially after Linda presented her analysis of the trust's manipulation. Judge Williams provided crucial support, sharing his own concerns about Margaret's handling of the trust after George's death. But our biggest break came from an unexpected source. Margaret's personal assistant, Jennifer. I can't do this anymore, Jennifer said, meeting me in a quiet cafe far from the Anderson offices. Not after what I found. She handed me a USB drive. Mrs. Anderson keeps a private diary on her computer. Last week, while she was meeting with the wedding planner, I made a copy. Her hands shook as she sipped her coffee. It's all in there. Everything about Mr. Sterling, about the trusts, about Thomas. The diary entries were damning. Margaret had been working with Sterling for years, using her position as trustee to facilitate his development schemes. When Thomas started investigating, they'd realized he was a threat. Sterling had supplied the medication, a blood thinner that, in the right dose, could cause a pulmonary embolism. Margaret had insisted on making Thomas's morning smoothies during his last visit home. The final entry made me physically ill. With Thomas gone and that silly girl signing away her rights, the lake house is finally ours. Robert's resort project can proceed as planned. All it cost was one troublesome son who never understood the importance of family business. I took everything to Detective Chen. Within days, the investigation expanded to include homicide. But we had to move carefully. Margaret was planning her wedding for the following weekend, and I had my own plans for her special day. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful. Margaret had spared no expense, transforming the lake house grounds into a fairy tale setting. White chairs lined the lawn leading down to the lake, where an elaborate arch stood ready for the ceremony. I waited until all the guests were seated, until Margaret, radiant in an expensive white gown, began her walk down the aisle. Then I stepped out from behind the arch, followed by Detective Chen, Emma, and a team of police officers. Margaret Anderson, Detective Chen's voice carried across the stunned crowd. You're under arrest for the murder of Thomas Anderson and fraud against the Anderson Family Trust. Margaret's perfectly composed face crumpled. You can't do this. This is my property. Actually, I interrupted, holding up a document. It's not. This is your father-in-law's true will, the one you hid. And this, I held up another paper, is proof that the documents you had me sign were obtained under false pretenses and are therefore void. The lake house belongs to me as Thomas intended. You have no proof of anything, Sterling shouted, starting forward, but police officers were already moving to block his path. We have your diary, Margaret, I said quietly. We know about the blood thinners, about how you and Robert planned Thomas's death when he threatened to expose your schemes, about all of it. What followed was chaos. Margaret and Sterling were led away in handcuffs, their perfect society wedding transforming into a perk walk. Guests fled in horror, leaving behind upturned chairs and scattered flowers. Through it all, I stood on the deck where Thomas and I had spent so many happy evenings, feeling his presence beside me. The aftermath brought more revelations. The investigation uncovered decades of fraud, with millions siphoned from the family trusts. Other Anderson properties were restored to their rightful owners, and the trust was placed under new management with Emma and me as co-trustees. Sterling's resort project died before it began. Instead, Emma and I established the Thomas Anderson Memorial Foundation, dedicating the lake house grounds as a public nature preserve. We kept the house itself private, a place for family, real family, to gather and heal. 1 year later, I stood on that same deck, watching Emma's kids play in the water while her new husband grilled dinner. The Anderson family had changed, grown smaller but stronger. Those who remained were bound by love and trust, not greed and manipulation. Last week, I found an old photo album in Thomas's study. In it was a picture from our first summer here. Thomas teaching me to sail, both of us laughing as I nearly capsized the boat. Next to it, he'd written, "The best kind of family is the one you choose." I'm keeping his office exactly as it was. But the rest of the house has slowly transformed. Emma's children have their own rooms now, filled with toys and laughter. The formal dining room has become a casual space where we gather for long, relaxed meals. The garden where Margaret once planned her society events now grows vegetables and wildflowers. Yesterday, I scattered some of Thomas's ashes in the lake at sunrise. As I watched the early morning light dance on the water, I remembered his words about wanting our children to grow up here. Though our own children never came to be, the house is filled with family all the same. Emma's kids, who call me Aunt Julia, Judge Williams, who visits every Sunday, even Jennifer, who found the courage to do the right thing and has become a dear friend. Margaret and Sterling are serving long sentences for Thomas's murder and financial fraud. The society pages that once celebrated their relationship now document their downfall. But their story is not the one that matters. What matters is the legacy Thomas tried to protect, not just the property, but the values his grandfather wanted to preserve: family, integrity, love. The lake house stands as a testament to that legacy, not as a symbol of wealth or status, but as a home where chosen family gathers, where healing happens, where love wins over greed. In the end, Margaret's perfect society wedding became something far more meaningful. The day justice was served, truth prevailed, and real family triumphed over false tradition. Thomas would have liked that ending.